History remembers the facts, but what about the phantoms that refuse to be forgotten? Welcome back to The Common Historian, where history meets the supernatural. I'm Jeremy, and tonight I'm joined by Dr. Dennis W. Carroll to uncover the dark occult secrets surrounding Abraham Lincoln. So grab your favorite beverage, dim the lights, and prepare to journey into the world where history refuses to stay buried. Welcome, Dr. Carroll. How are you tonight?
I'm doing good. How are you doing, my friend?
Oh, doing great. Excited about the topic we're going to discuss tonight, the haunted president,
Yeah,
Abraham
the
Lincoln.
haunted president. If there was ever a haunted president, Jeremy, he was absolutely the haunted one, the most haunted one of all. And that's as a paranormal investigator from way back, and I was done that for many many years. That's one place. There was a sort of a bucket list I used to have of places I would really love to investigate, and of course the White House was definitely on top of on that list. That and the Alamo and some other historical areas that I always wanted to go in and check it out, but that is definitely a one haunted house. Absolutely.
Oh, I can imagine. I did like a 3 4 minute video before I was doing these interviews on the hauntings at the White House. There's quite a few different ones. What kind of drew you to researching Abraham Lincoln and his him being haunted?
Yeah, he was just, a lot of people don't realize this about Lincoln, and we can say this. He was larger than life, okay? To this day, he is venerated by some people almost with godlike qualities. In the South, we were not that crazy about him, but he was respected, definitely. He was respected in his time. But of course, he was a politician like other politicians to a certain extent. He had political things and objectives he had to get done and all that. But when I see politicians like that and people that are in the public eye, I like to kind of pull the curtain back and see what's going on behind, the scenes on these things. And that's the thing it is with Lincoln when I first found out. Actually, honest to gosh, I mean, a lot of people don't realize this. He was a ghost hunter.
Oh,
He was actually, he was deep into paranormal stuff, believe it, more than people think. And a lot of this was brought upon him by his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. And she was deep in spiritualism and stuff like that. And I'll tell you why, because coming from a mother who had lost several children, and that was an unfortunate thing back in the day. Most of your children didn't usually make it. That include the president's children. He had several children of his own die. He had one son, and we'll talk about him later, Robert Todd Lincoln, who survived him. Only one child, I think, and he died, I think, in somewhere in the 1900s, somewhere like that,
yeah.
after his father. Anyway, I'm gonna save him for last because I got something special for him. But the interesting thing is that's where she was. That's the direction she was coming from. She wanted to really connect again with her children, and I think her father as well. Her father, who was, by the way, her whole family was for the South, actually, during the Civil War, whereas Lincoln was of the North, definitely. So you had sort of an unsettled family there, definitely life going on with that. And so a lot of these politics played into this. If you're a politician, that makes up a lot of your life, no matter which way you want to look at it and how you want to, take it. She kind of got him interested in this by having séances at the White House. And she had several medium friends of hers that would meet to try to contact the other veil side of veil. And she wanted to contact her children, but more so, I think she was looking to contact a brother who had died, I think, in the Civil War, fighting for the South, if I'm not mistaken. And she wanted to contact him, I think. That was one of the goals. So she got deep into spiritualism at that time, Jeremy. Was just really beginning to, well, it's been around for thousands of years in different ways, but it was beginning to sort of become a kind of a popular thing, especially with the war. I'm going to tell you something about war. War, whenever it comes to this planet, it seems to create a spiritual vacuum, a dark vacuum, like, because you got, hatred and evil and all this stuff going on in war. That's what fuels it. And so there's a darkness to it. And it seems that when these times come about, darker times, darker forces begin to move in the world to precipitate a lot of this stuff. And that was the very climate that they were living in at that time. We got to remember that, look at it from their perspective. we have a different perspective down through from this side of history than they had, definitely. But that's what was going on in their world. And so she kind of brought him into this. And of course, if mama's not happy, nobody's happy, So,
Yep.
so he definitely had to go along with it. But I believe he felt he had some certain attributes of his own. We're going to talk about that I think made him more interested than just a bystander, okay, or somebody just brought into it by his wife. I think that he had more of an interest this time. It may have began that way, but as time went on, I think he had more of an interest in it because he had some very unusual circumstances happen to him, and we're going to talk about that as well. But the interesting thing about Lincoln, with all this going on, with the war going on, with trying to keep the Union together and all these things going on, and of course, the intrigue of the politics of the time and all this stuff, that he had time to do this, that he had time to devote to this a little bit. It's very interesting. So here's the thing it shows me about that. If there's something really interests you, Jeremy, and you know this well, and I do too, if it really interests you, you make time for it.
Yeah.
But his wife too was very deeply interested in it as well, and like I said, she had her ulterior motives. I think to begin with, he was very curious about it, and but like I said, he had certain attributes to him. I think he may have had. I'm not going to go so full out blown and say he had psychic powers, but he had some very interesting attributes to him that were not common in most people. There's one incident later on in his life with the war going on and all this stuff. He had insomnia a lot. Of course, a lot of this stuff stayed on his mind. He stayed up night after night looking battle plans over and doing whatever had to do as a president. President can be a very, very involved job. Okay. Especially when there's a war going on. Absolutely. And so he had a very restless nights. And when he would burn the lamps late into the night, and he didn't sleep at all, And but when he did sleep, he was bothered with dreams. He talked about this to certain people. He said there are certain dreams that don't feel like dreams to me. They're more like, he called them visions. That he would have these, and one that particularly stood out with him, and some of them, had to do with the war, and then, things that he wanted done on the battlefield or whatever the situation. But he said the one that stood out to him the most is one night he dozed off on the couch or sofa there in the White House. And this was in the private part of the White House. He dozed off on the sofa. I guess he'd been sitting there going over some papers or something, and he's kind of dozed off. We all do that once in a while. And so he kind of dozed off, said, I had a dream. He said it was more than a dream, though. And he told his friend, I think it was Dr. Seward, I think his name was a very close friend of the president. He told him about this dream and a well-known incident. He said that he woke up to the sound of somebody crying, some weeping, sound, like people crying, crying. And he said when he woke up, he kind of come to, he's still on that sofa, right, And when he woke up, he got up, and he said, what is that? Said, no, it's, and he started following the sound. He went through one door and into another room. And the room actually went into, I think, a hallway. And when he got to the hallway, there was a soldier standing out there in the hall, which was kind of unusual. Soldiers had guard duty in the White House, but in this part of the, White House, it was kind of unusual to see soldiers there unless there was some, immediate reason or threat or something going on,
Yeah.
Anyway, Union soldier standing there, and he says, son, what's going on? What's all this crying and going on? And he said, well, sir, it's coming from this certain room, like it was a presentation room thing. He said, it's in there, sir. He said, it's the president, sir. He's been assassinated. And said he walked into that room and he saw a casket on a pedestal, like they sitting there, and he saw people standing around. But he said, I just saw them as shadows, like, And said that there was still that weeping and crying, going on. And he said, I started up to walk up to the casket and see who was in, see who was in that casket. When I came to myself, I woke up, And he said, I don't think I wanted to see. who
Yeah.
was in that casket. That's a very interesting vision when you think about a very prophetic. This was like maybe 2 years before he was assassinated. I mean, and there was no one going around saying, "I'm going to kill the president," and that was the, I believe, if I'm not mistaken on that. That was just something you didn't think about. Somebody didn't, assassinate the president at that time. That was, something that was kind of unthinkable. They didn't want to think about something like that. So that's very interesting. He would have a dream like that. A very prophetic dream. That 2 years later, it would be him in that same room in a casket.
So he had some kind of gift or something to be able to see the future, even though he probably didn't really understand it when he saw
Well, I
when
think in certain times in our life like that, when your mind is sort of preoccupied with other things or something that's going on, it kind of opens your sensitivity up to things, I think, sometimes. And maybe that was going on. I've had that happen a lot over the years. People come to me, Jeremy, say, "Why am I so sensitive? Why is this happening to me? Why do I see this? And why do I experience this?" And I say, well, sometimes it may be because it's you. You're sensitive to these things at that certain point in time. Women are very sensitive to these things, by the way, because of their emotional and intuition type stuff they've got going on. Women are very sensitive, okay, to that. They pick up on these things. And that is an interesting attribute that if I were talking to Lincoln, I would say, well, it's probably because you're born that way. Your sensitivities have opened up, especially in traumatic times or, times of worry or emotion or whatever the situation. And definitely he was going through that, at that time. So, yeah, I would have to say, without a doubt, something like that's going to happen, But a lot of people have said over the years, talked to me about their incidents they've had like this and prophetic dreams. I had a dream like that myself once, very close to that in some ways, that actually came true. And I don't know if this is just something in the recesses of the human mind is triggered by these things, or if there's an outside influence. You got to look at it some different ways. And I have to wonder, being he was getting deep into spiritualism, he was opening up. He had a lot on his mind and a lot of trauma going on there. There were reports of the dead coming in every day, how many were killed in battle and all this. I mean, they had to have a lot of emotional trauma going on with this guy, definitely. And so that definitely, in my book, would open you up traumatically wise to this kind of a thing and this illness. But I find it very interesting that it was about him. Was that his deepest fear that somebody was going to assassinate him? But like I said, at that point in time, they didn't really think about that. That was just something, it's like the guards at Fort Theater that night of the assassination. They were just, like, I'll be back in 5 minutes or something, kind of thing. They didn't think about it, this happening. Because the horrible part of it was, how could somebody do that? It was just unthinkable to them until it actually took place. Yeah, that's the interesting thing. And I thought years ago, I don't know if you're a fan of the Twilight Zone, but there was an episode of the Twilight Zone about this very thing, that very night at Fort Theater, where this guy goes back in time and he's going to warn Lincoln, and save him. And everything he does not turn out the right way he wants it to. And finally, at the end, Lincoln is finally assassinated. He goes back through time and he tells this other guy about it. He said, I did everything I could to stop it. And the guy says, well, have you thought about this? That maybe some things are meant to happen no matter what.
Yeah.
And almost very much like what really truly happened with Lincoln was almost as if it was going to happen. And some people had that in the back of their mind saying, oh, it's going to happen one day if we don't want, and it came to pass, to a lot of people. That was very interesting. And I have to wonder, maybe he had that kind of influence going on with him that way, and being deep in spiritualism and all that stuff. He was beginning to touch the sensitive side of his makeup in many ways, And I think that interest was his interest. I think that gave him his interest in a lot of that stuff, especially with his wife being interested in it and talking about it a lot. They were going over it with the mediums and all that stuff. I've sat in on a few seances myself, and I know how they go, how things go, and it is a very sometimes otherworldly kind of a thing going on there, because what you're doing is trying to part that veil between life and death. Going past that boundary, as Poe called it. That boundary between that. And so you have to wonder, you know, if when you start, here's the thing I'll tell a lot of people over the years, you know, when you look into the paranormal, you got to expect for it to look back sometimes. And I think that may be what was happening with Lincoln, without a doubt.
Yeah.
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 But I find it very interesting that he had that kind of a vision. And another thing about Lincoln, I don't know, I'll tell some few facts so the people might not know. He was a big cat lover, by the way. Had a lot of cats, and well, not a whole lot of cats, but he had a lot of cats, and he had one cat that was named aptly Demon. Okay, and I'm just gonna tell this as I happen to think about it. This cat was mean. Okay, that's why I got the name Demon. Okay, but they say to this day that cat haunts the White House.
Oh.
Yeah, he's a demon cat. Yeah. That he haunts the White House. The people have swore they've seen him, and he's supposed to be sort of an orange, tabby looking cat, but he's big and they say mean. You don't want to cross his path. But anyway, I find that interesting. And you know, another guy that was really big on cats, that was Edgar Allan Poe. Matter of fact, he did a lot of riding with a cat sitting on his shoulder. He was big on cats too. And here's the interesting thing about cats. I just gonna say this: cats are very spiritual type animals, supposedly. And there are some beliefs in the world that cats will keep bad and evil spirits out of your house. Why people used to have cats around their houses, you know. The Egyptians believed in the big time, okay, and they still, you know, still venerate the cat. It's the interesting thing about the cat and why it would be connected to Lincoln, and it's kind of interesting. Cats are thought to walk between worlds, between the living and the dead, the spirit and the physical world. They tend to seem to walk between those. They can see in both worlds, in other words, and operate in both worlds. And I find it interesting that he would be a cat person. Okay. That would be an interesting attribute. And I think on the other hand, Mary did not like cats that much. He was the one that kind of fed cats, I guess, and took care of them or whatever. But it's very funny to think that one of them still hanging around the White House. And this cat has been seen, I think, in the basement several times. That's why I would love to have an investigation in the White House. But flashing several years ahead after all this took place, there was an incident. I think it was the Queen of Denmark was staying at the White House one night. And they let her sleep. They won't let you do it anymore, but they was letting her sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. During the night, she heard a soft knock at the door. She went to the door, and it was Lincoln standing outside. Lincoln. She said, I saw him, you know, it was just plain today. He didn't have the hat on and all that, but she said, I knew who he was,
Yeah.
you know. And he was just standing there, looked like kind of confused look on his face. And then he turned around and walked off. And this was like, well, about 50 some odd years after he died. It's very interesting that his ghost. And you know what? Here's the thing about that. If you're going to talk ghosts or the remaining spirits of people, they do remain a lot of times, supposedly, where there's been a lot of trauma, a lot of pain, sorrow, anguish, or whatever, very high emotional type stuff going on there. And that was, the White House is definitely one of those places, like a hospital or you know, a funeral home or someplace like that. That would be definitely a place of trauma. And if your spirit were going to remain attached to something like that, they would definitely, I could see that happening, you know, in that respect. But that's fascinating to think all those years later, you know, because now they will not let you. Once upon a time, that was a big thing they would do. You know, you get to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. And some people paid a lot of money to do that too, from what I hear. But anyway, they don't allow that anymore, actually. But I'd love to camp out in that room, definitely, and see what would happen. But like I said, he did not spend a whole lot of time in his bedroom. Like I said, he walked the halls nightly of the White House. He was everywhere, you know. So if you're looking for Lincoln's ghost, you can look anywhere in the White House. You might have a good chance of running into him. He had a lot on his mind, had a lot going on, a lot of emotional stuff going on. He was one of those people, and I am too, like that. You couldn't sit still. You have to get up and move, you know, you couldn't walk around and all that, think things over, read stuff, whatever you had to do. So I can see where his emotional state was at, very high, at a very high of his, you know, prominence under these kind of circumstances. And this is laying you wide open for the paranormal, okay? Because this is, like I said before, opening your sensitivity And not just that, but it touches you in other ways, other different ways that it can approach you. And he knew, I think, without a doubt, he knew that he had certain powers of his own that touched on this as well. And I think that had a lot to do with some other stuff that was going on. But there were a lot of reports he was getting, from letters from mothers and fathers about their children and all that. So you had a lot of emotional stuff going on with that. So I can see why this stuff would happen with him. But that was very strange. He would have visions like he had more than one like that. But that was one that was very close to the actual thing that happened several years after that. That's very interesting. But he had I think there was one dream, they were visions, as he called them. He had about one of his children dying, and that came true as well. So he may have been, gifted in that respect. He may have had that kind of makeup to him. And this never really got deep into an exploring it with a job of president getting in the way and all that stuff. I'm sure that had a lot, your time was constrained, and his time was definitely constrained by a lot of that stuff. But that's fascinating, especially a wartime president with a lot going on like that he would talk about things like that and with people and with the seances and all that was going on. And she was a big push behind a lot of this stuff because she, like I said, she was deep in it. She's the one that he didn't bring mediums into the White House. She brought them in. She was the one that wanted to have these seances and try to contact her brother and some other people as well. So that's another draw on that. And that was another influence. A lot of people don't realize that you are influenced, of course, whether you know it or not, by your wife or your husband. The way they do things to get you involved in it too. So that definitely was part of the Lincoln household there, definitely. But that's very interesting. But Lincoln had a spiritual side to him. He talked about the evil and better angels of our makeup. He had a unique look at the spiritual aspect of things. And maybe the way he was raised in the country. He was raised by country folk closer to the earth and the things going on around them. That's why they're more superstitious in some ways, or they're more grounded in folklore. And a lot of people don't realize this. In his younger days, Lincoln was quite a wrestler. He wrestled. I think he has like 300 bouts and only lost one. That's pretty good record for wrestling. So he was deep in country life before he became a politician. So that's his makeup that you look at. He was definitely, in touch with the land and all that. Very much like we talk about that a lot with the Celtic and Irish peoples. They are very close to the land in themselves, and I think that has something to do with the spiritual side too. The closer you get to nature, the more you see the spiritual side of things as well. If you don't, then you're looking in the wrong places usually, because there is a definite, connection with that. And so I think that was part of Lincoln's makeup. And so he was ready for this kind of stuff, the things that happened. But I think, to me, he began to get a feeling that something was going to happen. I think, without a doubt, he knew that with visions and dreams like this, whatever you want to call them, was in the back of his mind that, hey, something like this could happen, something like that. And of course, we've seen that in modern times, how many assassinations or attempts on assassinations that presidents have had over the years. Back then, like I said, it was just unthinkable. You didn't think about that. But I find it very interesting that it was in the back of his mind. But you got to realize, too, that comes with the job. You say, hey, I might put my life on the line because of the very job I'm doing. That's not good to think about, but it's there. It's something you never get away from. So I think that had a lot of the psychological makeup with what was going on with him as well in that respect. But he found these stories, he found this stuff very fascinating. He was deep into looking into it. So that's why I said he was sort of the original ghost hunter kind of guy. He might not have actually been doing actual, real, honest to God investigation throughout the White House, but he was interested in it. He participated in the seances. We know that without a doubt. He was in on those. So he was definitely interested. And when you get interested, I'm going to get interested back with you, and I think that was happening. to a certain extent. But to me, that's why I call him the haunted president, because he had so much going on around him, so many different influences and stuff, you know. And then he had the war and all this stuff going on. He had a lot of drama. You know, when you send soldiers out on the battlefield, you're playing with people's lives.
Yeah.
You know, that hangs heavy on you. If you're any kind of a human being,
Yeah.
you know, that's going to have its effect on you too, psychologically. You know, that, hey, you're sending people out to, you know, maybe die, or they're going to get hurt or die or get killed. You know, that that's a very heavy burden to bear, you know, when you think that. So that's a very traumatic thing as well. To me, that's why they said of the greatness of the man. He had all this going on, but still he found time to answer the letters of mothers that they wrote him and stuff like that. He was trying to do the right thing in this, and I can say, well, that's good, because that shows what kind of a person he really basically was. I don't think looking at his makeup, having visions or dreams like that, to me tells me that he probably was very interested in that, very deep in touch with it. I think without a doubt that made him very interesting. Now, moving on to his assassination itself, is there were a lot of things that took place there that was sort of warnings about this. There were, I think, other people who had similar type dreams. Yeah, there was 2 or 3 reports on them said, yes, you know, I dreamed this, or I saw the headline of a paper and it had a black border on it, you know, and all these things happened later. They took place, you know, and but that night at Ford's Theater, when John Wilkes Booth assassinated him, that's some interesting. It sort of set in motion some very strange things when it happened. Now, he assassinated him from the back with a small derringer. Matter of fact, that derringer still exists. It is in the Smithsonian Institution. I have a friend who actually saw it and was offered to pick it up, and she said, "Oh no, I don't think I want to do that. I don't think I want to touch that." But it still exists, and the stuff he had in his pockets and all that, and we still have all this stuff. And I remember he had one folded up Confederate bill in his billfold, and he has in his pocket watch was still there. He had a few items on him, his glasses, and when you see that, it kind of makes this person more human when you see what they have it on them and all that. But that night, there were like some warnings, and nobody paid attention to it. And like I said, there was one part where there was one soldier on duty, and he wanted to go take a drink at the bar across the street. And the other one was supposed to relieve him, and he was late and all this. And there was a time when there was nobody standing there watching, you know, and I'm thinking, you know, how inept can you be? This is the president of the United States, you know. It was just like almost like that, you know, that thing I drew with the Twilight Zone. It was almost as it was meant to happen. It was fate playing out. You know, Shakespeare says it is, you know, all of life is a play, you know, and that's what you see here with this almost. It's as if it was going to happen. It was, and even Lincoln sort of knew this. That's the interesting thing, you know, that he sort of like, hey, I'm up on this too. I know that what, you know, this could probably happen, you know, or going to happen. If you knew that, Jeremy, that something like that were going to happen, you would play with it, or would you try to play against it? You know, it makes you wonder about that. You know, maybe I'm thinking about this. Maybe I need to change something here. You know, you have to wonder, you know, what was going through his mind with that kind of stuff. But that night, you know, was just, it was so obvious. And Booth being able to slip in there, do what he had to do, shot him in the back of the head, in one shot, you know, and he jumped over the railing and looked back. He hit the stage, broke his ankle when he hit the stage, looked back and said, "Stick tyrannus," you know, Soviet to tyrants, from a play of Shakespeare, by the way. We're going to talk about him in a minute. Yeah, he's got some very interesting part to play in this too, absolutely. But he was able to make it to a horse and escape. I had a horse waiting for him and all that. And I'm going to tell about his ultimate fate and some weird stuff with that too. But anyway, during the whole thing that happened, you know, just so quickly, there was a woman sitting next to Lincoln. She was like the date of this. I think it was blood got all over her dress. You know, when he shot her, you know, shot him in the back of the head, very much like what happened with John Kennedy when he was assassinated, in the back of the head, you know. And there was one part when that happened, that Jackie Kennedy actually leaned over and went in the back seat and took part of his skull and tried to put it back on.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that very thing happened to Lincoln to a certain way. And Mary Todd was just like, she was not unlike Jacqueline Kennedy. She was like, stuck in the time period there. She was stuck. She didn't know what was going on. She was so shocked by this. And they all were. And the reason I mentioned the blood on the dress is that dress disappeared out of history.
Oh.
Nobody knew what happened. That wasn't the dress. The woman was supposed to keep the dress. And the Union officer that was with her actually went insane, I think, and went insane later after this happened and died in an insane asylum. And she went on and had another life. Years later, in the street across the house from that, they were doing some renovation on this house. And that, I think it might have been next to the house that they brought him to after he got shot. They took him out of the theater and took him to, which probably made matters worse. You should not move anybody in traumatic condition like that. But they took him across the street and put him in a bed in a house over there. But I think it might have been a different house. Anyway, they were renovating this house and found that dress in great, still in good condition, still with the blood stains on it and the wall let out. So you can go to the museum and still see that dress to this day. And there was a lot of strange, very strange like that went on with this whole thing, And like I said, if you see something like it, you have to wonder about predestination. Something like that was bound to happen. And they were like, we know it, but we're the players in this and we can't stop it. That's kind of the weird look that you get on that, the feeling you take out of it. But that's when he, finally drew his last breath in that house, and the man, I forget who it was, said he now belongs to the ages. That was and he lived several hours, good many hours after that, but he never gained consciousness or said anything to anybody. But his wife said he did, squeeze her hand, but that could have been a reflex thing, I mean, it doesn't mean he was there, because that was a very, very vital head wound. Yeah. Something you don't come back from like that. But anyway, and we're going to talk about in a minute the interesting contrasts and connections between that and the Kennedy assassination, which is very strange, bizarre, and that as well. But when you look back on that and the way that Booth got away and all that. And by the way, I'm going to talk about his brother, John Wilkes Booth's brother. He was an actor as well. There were three Booth brothers who were actors. One of them was named Julius, and I'm trying to think of what the other one's name was. His name was, I can't think of his name. I'll find it in a minute. But anyway, there were three Booth brothers, and John Wilkes was sort of the one that was not as very famous. He was well known, but not as famous as his older brother. Anyway, I have actually been to the theater they acted in Charleston, South Carolina, a very old theater there. And all of them acted one time or another, acted in this theater. And they were great Shakespearean actors. That's why you got that line from Shakespeare when he shot him, he jumped down and says, "Sic semper tyrannis, so be it to tires." That's, I think, from King Henry or something in the Shakespearean plays. So they would know, they knew their stuff. They were nothing but very good Shakespearean actors. And there was one time, Jeremy, when they all three acted together in the same play. Only one time, though, after that. So that's interesting, in that respect. But let me find out right quick, I'll look up the name of the other brother right quick. But this brother was well known more than John Wilkes Booth was. And
the assassination kind of made John Wilkes famous.
I got it right here. 1 second. Edwin, didn't think of his name. Edwin Booth. Okay, Edwin Booth was the older brother. Now, don't forget that, because we're going to come back to Edwin. Edwin's got a part to play in this too. Okay, but the other brother, Julius, who was named after their father, by the way, was not well known. He tried to, but John got very well known for what he did, more so than what his acting career. Yeah, he will be known for that. Now, there's some interesting paranormal stuff around him too. We're going to talk about, but The most interesting thing about that, and I thought this for years, being sort of an amateur historian myself, I had heard years ago that John Wilkes Booth's body, after the autopsy, they put it in a, I don't know if this is true or not now. I have to do some more research on this. But they put it supposedly in an iron coffin and weighed it down and threw it in the Potomac River. Now I got to think about that. God, that sounds weird, And I found out later that this was not supposedly true. That the brother Edwin asked that he be given his body after he was, caught in the barn and killed. He asked that he be given his body. And he supposedly buried it in an unmarked grave in the family plot in Baltimore. I would like to check on that and see if that is true. But I heard for many years it was weighted down and thrown. They didn't want anybody to have access to it for some weird reason. I don't know why. But they did an autopsy on Booth and then supposedly placed him in an iron coffin and threw it in the Potomac. And I always thought that sounded kind of flaky, weird, but kind of flaky. Why would you do that,
Yeah.
But like I said, it was only one time they all three acted together, and their father was an actor too, from England, by the way. He was English, and Booth, of course, John Wilkes Booth, was more for the South, and his brothers were for the Union in their outlook on it. So they were a divided family, like a lot of families at that time were divided,
Yeah.
on that stuff. But Edwin was more well known. And he actually had bought a part in that theater in Charleston I was in. I actually went. It's supposed to be haunted by him, by the way, by his ghost, supposedly. Edwin had a stroke years later and died of a stroke in his house in Baltimore. I think this is where they live. But anyway, the interesting thing about that, like I said, Edwin's got a lot to play in that when we get to this. But let's get back to the assassination itself. Okay, when that happened, you got some parallels between that and Kennedy we're going to talk about a little bit here. It's very strange. I mean, we call it synchronicity. It's weird stuff, okay? And I've said this before a long time ago, Jeremy. I don't believe in coincidences anymore, okay? Coincidences are just too convenient sometimes for their own reasons. So you had some very strange stuff going on between the Kennedy and Lincoln. Now, Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln, and Lincoln supposedly had a secretary named Kennedy. Okay. You had that link. You had the same, they were like, on roughly the same age, married at the same age. You've got so many correlations going on here. You got to sit back and say, what's going on with this? When Booth actually killed him in a theater and ran to a warehouse, Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy in a warehouse and ran to a theater. So you got a reverse thing going on here. And I would tell all your everybody watching tonight, go check it out because there's very strange stuff between this going on. You got a lot of correlation that's really, really weird. And look at Lincoln's vice president was a Johnson, and so was Kennedy's, and they were both men from the South. So look at the correlation. It keeps going on and on and on and expounding on it. It's wild. And then you have that's again, like I say, it's almost like you're watching a play take place. It's almost as if it's acting out. Predestination, as they call it. You have to wonder about that. And the interesting thing now, when Booth, there's been a lot of contention over the years that Booth was not really the one that died in that barn or at the shootout at the barn, I call it.
Yeah.
He didn't actually die in the barn. He died on the porch. They pulled him up on the porch of the farmhouse, and he died on the porch. But they shot him several times. He was burnt too pretty badly in the farm because they set the barn on fire, which was really not necessary. Why they did that, I never have figured out to this day why that was necessary, because they had the barns around him. He was not going anywhere, why would you try to smoke him out? That doesn't make sense. But sooner or later, he had to come out.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, he was shot and wounded. He already had a broken ankle that had never set. And finally, when they got to him, I read a lot about this, went into it. It's very interesting. I wanted to know where exactly this took place at and what happened. And there was a historian that traced this. He traced his route from where he shot him at Ford's Theater to the ferry that they got on, and then from there on out into the countryside where they ran into Dr. Mudd. Dr. Mudd's the one that set his bone and didn't really know that he was working on Lincoln's assassin, and they put him in prison for doing it. And he didn't even know he was not in on the plot. But, there were a lot of people supposed to be in on the plot. They were hanged later, One of them was a woman, by the way. Supposed it was part of the plot they were in. They had a plot, a wide-ranging plot, to assassinate not the vice president, the secretary of war, so on, a whole lot of the cabinet of Lincoln. They had, and none of them went through. One stabbed somebody, I think. Actually tried to. The gun didn't work, didn't go off, and he tried to stab him. And I think it was the Secretary of War, and he had a scuffle down in the fight, and overcame the guy and held him for the authorities to get there. So that failed. Everything failed with the way they wanted it to go. The only thing that succeeded was Lincoln's assassination. And mainly, a lot of people have said over the years, a lot of historians have said that was because he was the one that formulated this whole thing. He's the one that said, "I'll take care of the big guy, okay? You take care of the rest of the little guys." And that's probably why they succeeded. It's like that old saying: if you're gonna do something, you do it yourself. And he left it up to the wrong people to do, which is good for them, I guess. So definitely. But that's the way that went down. But later on, there were a lot of people hung for it. A lot of people went to prison. I always felt Mud, got the short end of that stick because he was just being the doctor. He didn't know who he was working on. He was not part of it. But yeah, I think he spent 2 or 3 years in prison because of that. That's ridiculous, but that's the way it went. But anyway, when they caught up with Booth in that barn, he was in bad shape. Anyway, he was going to make the last stand there. So when they got him out they got him up on the porch and all that, he looked at his hands, and the last words he said was useless. It's all useless. And then he died, supposedly there. Now, there's been a lot of contention over the years if that was really him that died, because a lot of people said that the guy I saw on the wagon, they took his body off, that was not Booth. A lot of people said that, and a lot of contention went on until someday they decided to attack that DNA-wise. We may never know for sure that's who it really is in that, supposedly in that. But I don't see why there would be anybody else. I mean, in that case, and why they would have messed up on it or tried to cover up something like that.
Yeah.
But to me, the guy that traced that, and he found out the exact location where all the, of course, the barn is no longer there. The farmland is now in the middle of an interstate. And he said that he found the post where the barn was. You can still find these things archaeologically wise. He found the post where the barn was and found out, where the house, the porch was. And the very spot that Booth died is in the middle of the interchange. And it's a grassy spot maybe about 4, 5, 6 yards wide. And that's it. That's the only place left remaining. And he said, "I'm not going to tell anybody where it's at because I found it, but I don't want anybody going there and doing anything, to commemorate this guy." But he said, "I know where it's at. And I've left, my research on it. One day they can look at it, that's where it's at. That's his geolocation in the middle of an interstate." That's wild. Think about it. Yeah. But anyway, that's where Lincoln killer ended up in that respect. Or is he in Baltimore? Is he lying in Baltimore? Or
I looked it up. It did say he's in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, in the Booth family plot. Is what it's saying.
Well, there's some really strange stuff going on with Lincoln's body. We're going to talk about that. There was a plot to steal his body, and that sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie, but it's a real thing. They actually were going to steal it and hold it for ransom, like for $200,000. And it was a crime syndicate, and they wanted this guy released from jail who was in jail and prison at the time, to engrave some plates for them. They were going to do this, get Lincoln's body and hold it hostage. And they almost succeeded, Jeremy. They had him out of the tomb. They had the casket out of the tomb and were about to pull it out of the tomb into the graveyard and take it off when, lo and behold, they did not know it, but a Secret Service agent had been following them, had been watching them and following them, and he's the one that raised the alarm and kept them from stealing Lincoln's body. And when this incident happened, a lot of people got to say, "Oh, wait a minute, we got to do something about this. We can't let this happen again. And so they formed a society. Now listen to this. This is weird. They formed a society called Lincoln's Guardians. And they sort of was maybe like a handful of people, maybe 10 or 12 people the most. They said, we're going to safeguard his body until we can fix it up and everything is fixed up so that nobody could ever steal this body. Okay.
No.
And that was this little association they made, Lincoln's Guardians. And it gets real freaky here. Listen to this. Okay. So they said, okay, we're going to fix it so that nobody can ever steal it again. But before that, it's going to take a while. We got to do this. So inside the tomb, they would hide the body in different places. They would hide the coffin in different places. One time they hid it under a bunch of cement bags and tools and all that to keep people from breaking in and stealing it until they could fix the tomb the way they wanted it, to get it done that way. So they were, and I think there's one instance where somebody kept Lincoln's body in their own basement for like about a year or so while they was making preparations and all this. This is weird stuff. Think about it. It's getting really freaky here. Lincoln's traveling more now when he's dead than when he was alive, okay? They're moving this guy around different places. And the last time they finally fixed everything up, and it was 1901 when they opened his tomb, his casket for the last time. They opened his coffin. And there was one boy there that he lived, I think, to 1963 or something. He was a young boy. He tells about this. This is a piece of history, folks. When you think about it, this is wild. They opened Lincoln's coffin, and you can still see who he is. He's gotten a little darker. The beard is still there. The mole, it's Lincoln. It's without doubt Lincoln. And the reason, and Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's son, is there when they opened it. Okay. He said, I won't be there. Because rumors were going around after they tried to steal the body, that wasn't really Lincoln in the tomb. This had been going around for like 30 years saying, oh, that's not him in there. That's not him. Everybody's going to some. So Lincoln's son said, I'm going to put an end to this. I'm going to be there when they open that up and then verify who it is. And so there was like about 30 people standing there when they opened this coffin. And they said, of course, it had kind of a musty smell like to it when they opened it up. But it said you could still see him. Said it had, the boy that talked about it, the young boy said he had like white, like the frost that was on him.
Oh.
You know. And this does happen. He was almost mummified, okay, because they were taking him on the funeral train around the country several different times. He was mummified to a certain extent, but you could still see who he was. You still see the skin had gotten a little darker, and that's what happens with mummification, okay? Mummification darkens your skin and all that. And so he said they opened it up, and he said, that's my father, okay? And we all see that, don't we? And they all agreed to their sign. We signed papers to it. Yes, sir, that's it. And he said, this will stop the rumors forever, okay? And now, at that time, they put a steel cage over that coffin, buried it 10 foot down under 10 feet of solid concrete. They said no one will ever disturb his body again.
Yeah.
So that's where Lincoln supposedly, resides to this day, underneath 10 feet of concrete because nobody can see it. But I will not, this is a story, show for another time, but there are people out there, Jeremy, professional grave robbers that you can hire that will go get certain parts of certain people, okay? If you want it, if you pay enough, you can buy anything in this world, okay? That includes you could have Emily Brown's skull if you wanted to, whatever you didn't want. You could pay these people. I've actually seen them actually make real videos of doing this. This verifies I'm so-and-so. They show you the grave, and this I'm getting the skull for you, or whatever it is you want. These people are professionals, and they do this. And this is a part of collecting nobody ever talks about. This is very illegal, of course, very illegal. And but this happens. It is real stuff. So you could see why you would take so much pains, especially, that's like Shakespeare. There's a curse on his tombstone, blessed, he who disturbs my bones, don't do it. It's a bad idea. He's got a curse on it. You didn't do that back in the day. It didn't mess. People needed to stay at rest, and that's the way they felt with Lincoln. Nobody will ever disturb him again after this. From now on, 10 foot of concrete is what you got to go through to get to him, and that would take bulldozers and a lot of special equipment to do that. Definitely. So Robert Lincoln, said, I'm going to make sure to stop this stop these rumors, and prove without a doubt that's my, father in that doom. That was very interesting. He died not too long after that, but I've got one strange incident that happened with him. This was not long after his father, I think, had been assassinated, and he was on a train in New Jersey, and he was fixing to board a train. Now the trains had come up to the station. You had about maybe a foot and a half space between the train and the station itself. And he accidentally stepped wrong and fell down in this thing. He was about to be killed. And a hand reached down, grabbed him, and pulled him back up on the step. And the man that saved his life was Edward Booth.
Wow.
Edwin Booth is one that, the brother, the man that killed his father, saved his life. True story, folks. Really happened. Talk about weird now. When you talk about Lincoln, it gets really weird.
Yes, it seems like there's quite a bit of mystery surrounding a lot of that. And I had read
a lot of history.
Oh, there is. I had read about that connection between Edward and Robert Todd Lincoln. But yeah, there's so much different things that are it's just fascinating.
Yeah, when I first heard that about him actually saving Robert Lincoln, I thought, God, that is freaky. The man that, the brother of the man that's assassinated your father saves your life. That sort of paid him back, in a way, in a strange way. And he said he didn't know who was saving at the time. He just, grabbed the guy up and kept him from getting crushed. But he knew him. Robert knew who he was because, he was a well-known actor. He was much further well-known than John was. When he saw that, he was astounded by that. So he wrote him a letter and told him, "Sir, you saved my life the other day, and I know who you are, and I think you knew who I was. And I'm the son of Abraham Lincoln."
Yeah.
And when he heard that, when he was told that, it said it made him feel a whole lot better to know that, hey, maybe I paid back a little bit of what my brother did, And so that gave him a lot, gave him sort of satisfaction. It would, I guess, knowing that you've done something like that, and then your family's being blamed for something like that, and you get to pay back a little bit. That's very interesting. But like I said, there again, you got that very strange hand of predestination going on here. You got some weird, there's a lot of weird stuff going on with this case. And I told somebody about that not long ago. If it's not paranormal, I don't, it's going to do till the real thing comes along because there's a lot of stuff going on around it. It's very strange. But that's the interesting part of history I like. I know you do too. You look behind the curtain and see what really happened in those times. You don't hear a lot of this kind of stuff in the history books. They don't tell you these things that went on. And I think that's a shame because if you're going to tell history, you need to tell all of history. Unfortunately, people do not see history as a sacred thing like you and I do. We say history should be sacred and it should be left alone. You don't mess with it and record it the way it says it should be recorded and told. But unfortunately, some people don't see it that way. But I think who was it said that history is written by the winners of wars and stuff. That's the way history goes. Yeah. But that's a fascinating stuff. He was a fascinating man and a very interesting man. And I would, tell your, viewers to check him out and check out some more. There's a whole lot more to this and just what we kind of just went over the surface of it tonight. But it goes a lot deeper and it's very interesting.
It is. It's very fascinating and all the connections, especially the connections between John Kennedy and Lincoln. Those are just fascinating. It's like you said, I know you don't believe in the coincidence, but it's it's more of a they're so similar. It's fascinating.
Well, that's what I've said to a lot of people over the years. You see things like this happen. You have to wonder if there's not some other intelligence going on around some of this stuff. So you have to wonder about it. There's been some people even say that, since I mentioned time travel, that there are maybe people going back through time trying to mess around with history. And I've actually seen some strange evidence of that, where there was one a writer friend of mine who was researching this old church, and they went all over this old church. They were looking at things and all that. He was researching the history of it, and they were looking for this one woman's plaque or something that she had up. Could never find it. And they went all over the church. Okay, 2 weeks later, they go back to the same church and they're looking, and there's this big plaque of this woman's name on it. And they said, there's no way that we could have missed that. Where did that come from? So they get the rector of the church out there and said, hey, well, did you put this plaque up last week? And the man said, that's funny. That's been up there 30 years. What are you talking about? And they said, there's no way, we could have missed that. We were, looking for it. And I have seen instances of things happen like that. So you have to wonder, is somebody screwing around with time or history or what's going on here? Would it be obvious that if, somebody could do that, and if they are in the future, far-flung future time travelers, are they messing around with our history here? That's not a good thing, because if you do the wrong thing, you may unravel everything. That might not be a good idea to do that. But I remember reading when I was a kid a story about the time travelers and what they would do. They got rich by time traveling. They would go back and they would steal equipment, very rare equipment or something from the war or whatever, and hide it in a certain place and bury it, let it age for 200 years, and go back in time travelers and dig it up. And we'll get a lot of money off of these antiques. And the guy says, I like to deal with you guys. You come up with the best shape antiques that there are out there. And they said, well, we got a secret. But what if that is really going on? You got to wonder about stuff like
Yeah,
that.
you gotta wonder.
And we've seen pictures, Jeremy, of people that looked out of place in those pictures, like modern day people and 100 years ago.
The one I think was it.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a picture with it was like I think in Gettysburg during the Gettysburg address, and there was like someone that looked very out of place. They were like they were dressed very differently than everybody else. Of course, there is the Mandela effect. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mandela effect, but a lot of I wonder, like you said, if there's people going back and changing small things.
A lot of that, a lot of the thing, and I have to say this, man, I've researched this a lot. A lot of it is in the mind. Something we get a certain phase or something, we get it stuck in our mind. We think it's that way, and it may not be that way. We just perceive it that way.
Sure.
Sometimes that's what the Mandela effect is. But then you have stuff like that church thing happening, and then the woman says she went back and checked the records of that, and the church supposedly caught on fire at a certain year. And when they went and checked back the records, it was a year later than what they first had said. She said, I know, I remember reading that as the other date. Now it's changed. It's a year later, You have to wonder about stuff like that. What's going on with that? I mean, because the mind does perceive things, but it doesn't make mistakes so obvious like that sometimes. Especially if you're a researcher, you're very up on the date. You're not going to mess up the date on something, yeah.
You keep track of that. That could almost be we could almost discuss that type of for another show, maybe in the future, time travel and, different things like that.
That's like, I've said before, if you were going to be a time traveler, I'd come back in a UFO and everybody think I was an alien, okay?
Yeah.
Would think. That'd be a sneaky way to get in. Maybe my time around this machine would look like a UFO, okay? That would be one way to keep people off guard. And I'd like this question I got for you tonight. What if, we're talking about what if here, okay? What if all of the classical Greek statues are not really statues? What if they're victims of Medusa?
Oh, true. True. Yeah, that is. I never thought of that. That could that. You just
Mhm.
never know. Well, I think, we're running a little over our time. It was a fascinating, on the haunted president. I know we went into a little bit of time travel and all of that, but, you know, it's always a pleasure having you, Dr. Carroll, on.
Always a pleasure.
You're full of knowledge and great stories. I thank you for joining and kind of going into the Lincoln's haunted legacy with us tonight. Folks, if you enjoyed the episode, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a weekly deep dive into haunted history. Drop a comment and let me know, do you think Lincoln was generally psychic or sensitive? Next time, on the next episode, we'll be sitting down with JD Hill and talking about his paranormal journey. Until then, remember, history never truly dies, it just finds new ways to haunt us. Keep digging into the darkness.